And welcome, welcome, welcome. This is Peter Winnick. I'm the founder and CEO of Thought Leadership Leverage, and you're joining us on the podcast today, which is Leveraging Thought Leadership. I'm really excited about my guest today. It's Joe Nocera. Joe is a Bloomberg opinion columnist. He's written columns for Esquire, GQ, the New York Times, former editorial director at Fortune, best-selling author, and as of late, I don't know what the equivalent of best-selling is, but has created a podcast called The Shrink Next Door, which if you haven't listened to it yet, you must. And it's been a bit of a runaway success with 13 million downloads. So welcome aboard, Joe.
Thanks for having me, Peter.
Great. So let's just dive in. What I thought we would do today, because you're a little bit different than many of the guests that we've had on, but you've been incredibly successful for a long, long period of time in multiple formats. So you've got, the dailies at a little paper called the New York Times, magazines, GQ, Esquire. As of late, you're at Bloomberg. And then you've also been a best-selling author in the nonfiction piece on the collegiate sports stuff. And now you're Bloomberg, and now the success in the podcast. So I thought you might have a couple things to share with folks on how to be successful getting content out there in multiple formats. Any place you'd like to start?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I started in the magazine business, and I'm really glad I did because the magazines, at least when I was doing it in the 80s, put a real premium on good writing. And so you really had to sweat over the writing. And I think that has been something that has always characterized my work is that I don't mail it in, even on intense deadlines. So I remember some blogger was criticizing me for, I don't know which sin it was this time, but somebody else wrote in and said, Larry, if it was this easy, if it's easy, you'd be doing it. Everybody would be doing it. But this guy's honed his craft for 20 years, and that's why he's writing for the New York Times, and you're not. And I think there's a lot of truth to that.
So how do you deal with that today where, the monthly magazines, when they used to arrive in your mailbox 15, 20 years ago, as a reader, you look forward to that thump of GQ coming in and knowing that you're going to sit down and spend 20, 30 minutes with an article. Today, there's this pressure between we want quality, but there's this cadence that says, oh, you've got to put out, 10 pieces a day on Instagram and this many on LinkedIn and that, and just the sheer volume makes it harder and harder to put out quality. So how do you balance that?
Well, I think not everybody does it, well or as well as they could. I mean, in my particular case, I'm old enough to kind of ignore a lot of the post something 10 times a day stuff. I can't do it. I won't do it. I'm not going to do it.
Yep.
But I also think, look, here's a really good example. The Miami Herald is is a regional newspaper that, like all regional newspapers, is hurting.
Yes.
And so there's more pressure for the reporters to do more with less, as they say. And yet they gave a woman named Julie Brown months and months and months to write about Jeffrey Epstein and his, basically punishment back in 2008. And that 3-part series sparked the entire Epstein furor that has ensued ever since.
Sure.
So it's also really a function of your employer saying, I understand that the quick hits aren't the only thing we do or the only thing we're going to do. We also have to pay attention to the longer, harder investigative stuff that takes a long time.
So let's talk about that. So in some instances, you do have to convince your employer that they need to allow you to have more time to invest in going deep, right? And they have things for you to do and your resource, etc. In some other instances today, where people have developed their own followers and such, and don't have that intermediary, you still have to justify the investment to get some sort of a return, right? So whether you have the employer, whether it's the Miami Herald or the Times or Bloomberg or whatever the case may be, or you're going direct, you still have to know when to balance that time and place to make the investment into going deep versus you still have to sort of feed the beast on a regular basis.
Well, I think that's exactly right. I haven't been a freelancer in a long time, but as a Bloomberg employee, as a Bloomberg columnist, where there is a premium on getting copy out there. I mean, what I try to do is I try to do a quick hit when I see one that I can do, like an appreciation of Lee Iacocca right after he dies, for instance. And I try to balance that with things that take 3 or 4 days, of intense reporting to write 1,000 word column. But I think if you're a freelancer or if you're you're working for yourself, you kind of have to do the same thing. The work that doesn't pay all that well that you're passionate about needs to be balanced, obviously, with some work that you might not think is the greatest in the world, but that pays well. I mean, that's kind of the way it works.
So is it a little bit of balancing sort of the short term versus the long term? Because you can't make, in the case of the Miami Herald that you mentioned, they couldn't afford to have half their staff working on these long term Jeffrey Epstein level interviews, research for months and months and months when there was no story under the story, right?
That's absolutely right. You do have to balance the short term against the long term, and I've written, in my case, I've written books without quitting my job. I take some
Yep.
leaves here and there, but you're working on the book, but on the weekends and at night, and maybe on a occasional weekday, but you're also writing your columns, and you're trying to balance the two things so that you're not letting either side, either the publisher or the newspaper, down.
Yeah, so let's talk about that for a minute. So if you think about that as sort of balancing your portfolio, you have your day job and you have obligations to your employer to produce X number of content to reach the audience that they want you to reach. And then you have a book project, which, might take you 12, 18 months, whatever the case may be. Tell me what's different about not just the development of a book, but then the whole marketing and exposure and all that piece. So tell me sort of the differences between the two.
The first difference is that when you finish writing a book, you actually have a product, and in a way that you don't when you write a column. And writers are not very good marketers or salesmen. Some of them are, but many of them aren't.
Yep.
And so suddenly you're in this position where you have to really try and sell yourself and sell your product and get people interested and get on NPR and get the book reviewed and send it out to a lot of people. It's an interesting thing for I'm not a salesman, and no writer I know is a natural salesperson. It's not the personality type.
Sure.
So it feels different and a little awkward, and you kind of have to go into this zone where you stop thinking about being a writer and start thinking about just you're proud of this product that you've just produced, and you want people to read it, and you'll say anything and do anything to promote it. Most of my work has been written before the age of Twitter. So now at least you've got Twitter and social media, and I've learned to use my Facebook page for this purpose, and I've learned to use Twitter for this purpose. But also, I've been around a long time. I know a lot of people. I pick up the phone and I call NPR and I say, "Hey, can you get me on?"
Right.
Which in my normal life I would never do.
So how do you sort of balance those two? Because what I've seen is that a lot of folks that are really, really smart at creating content, thought leaders and authors and such, when it comes into the marketing fold, they sort of don't want to soil their purity by partaking in any of those activities, which doesn't serve them well.
Well, I don't think spoil the purity is the right word, although I know there's certain cases where that's true. I think it's more an uncomfortableness.
Okay.
This is not what I'm good at. This is, I feel awkward.
I'm not a promoter. Right.
Having to call somebody up and say, "Hey, me, think about me." And I've been lucky in that my books, they've always, the publishing house has always either had an in-house publicist or hired a freelance publicist to help promote it, which is super helpful.
Yep.
But I think, honestly, I think the writer or the thought leader, if he or she is unwilling to promote themselves, the work isn't going to get out there and spread as widely. It's really that simple.
Right. And you see we're living in the age at some level of the celebrity journalist, the Michael Wolff, et cetera, right? Where some are really, really good at it and some aren't.
Michael Wolff's a celebrity journalist?
Well, okay, we could debate that later. a well-known journalist, let's say.
It was the journalist part that I was
talking about. Who am I to argue with a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist? We'll give you that one. If you're enjoying this episode of Leveraging Thought Leadership, please make sure to subscribe. If you'd like to help spread the word about our podcast, please leave us a review and share it with your friends. We're available on Apple Podcast and on all major listening apps, as well as at thoughtleadershipleverage.com/podcasts. Okay, so I want to move to the shrink next door for a minute, because when you and I met early this summer, I had just coincidentally finished listening to the shrink next door and was blown away by it, just totally blown away. So I wonder if you could briefly tell us the story of how long this story was you were sort of with this story, and then I want to sort of move to the modality of podcasting, because that's a whole interesting universe. So quick, tell the story of the shrink next door, and then we'll talk about the podcast.
Well, I mean, the story is pretty simple. In 2010, I bought a house here in Southampton, and I was under the impression that the house next door was owned by a big shot New York psychiatrist, and that this other guy who was around the property all the time was his caretaker. And the shrink invited me over, my wife and I, over for drinks, and the house was just completely full of photographs of himself with famous people and so on. So come back the following summer, and the shrink's not there anymore. And the little guy who I thought was the caretaker comes over and he says, "Hi, Joe, I want you to meet my sister. I haven't seen her in 27 years."
Wow.
It's like, whoa. And then he goes on to explain that the reason is that the shrink had cut him off from everybody in his life and had essentially taken over his life. And that he, not the shrink, owned the house next door. And that he was not the shrink's caretaker, he was his patient.
Wow.
So, needless to say, that caught my attention. So, in 2011 and 2012, I worked sporadically on a magazine story about this situation, but it was ultimately not published. And I'm so grateful now that it wasn't, because I put it in my drawer. I put it in my drawer and kept it there till I joined Bloomberg in 2017. And I pulled it out and I showed it to the head of the
No,
podcast.
wait, I just want to say most journalists, Joe, have a story or two like that they got into, they dove into, they invested time, and then they filed away in the drawer for some reason, never to see the light of day. But you got sort of lucky that it was able to come back to life, right?
100%. If podcasting hadn't been invented, it would still be in the drawer. Because what really happened was that my son, one of my sons, who's in the TV business, just called me up out of the blue one day and said, "Dad, you have to listen to this podcast." He was talking about Dirty John, which is Wondery's first big hit. And I listened to it and I called him back and I said, it's great, but why did you want me to listen to it? He said, "Because that's your story. Just take your story, do it in that format, and it'll work." And he was completely right.
So now talk about moving it from what was intended to be an investigative piece in a magazine, long form, to now, what's this podcast thing, and how do I do this? Tell an amazing story, and what format, and like how did you go through that process?
It was pretty wild. First of all, we were really lucky because Bloomberg wound up cutting a deal with Wondery to do it, a co-production. So we had these people who we knew could do this kind of thing really well. They hired a really terrific audio producer for me, and I knew who most of the characters were. There's a few who were new to the project, but most of them I had talked to back in 2011, 2012, and we just started interviewing them. That part was sort of normal, but not quite. It's not quite the same as interviewing somebody for print. There are certain details that you want in a podcast and certain sounds that you're looking for and all that sort of. So I learned about that. But the real learning experience for me came when it came time to write it, because it was a very, very different kind of writing, much more like writing a script for a TV show where, you want to put the people on the edge of their seat every 15 minutes when you break for the commercial, and where there's a lot of thought goes into what to tell and what to hide, and when to tell it and when to hide it.
You also chose as a format to have, in many instances, there were actors reenacting some of the characters' scenes, and then you had some of the actual folks that you were interviewing, and then you sort of overlaying the narration. So that's really, really intricate sort of weaving of what to reveal when, how to tell the story, when to get an actor to reenact something. It was really wonderfully done.
Well, the actors were because we had no choice, really. No, seriously. We had all this written material from the shrink himself
Right.
from back in 2011, 2012, when he was busy, when he was busy trying to keep the story out of the New York Times and writing these lengthy memos defending himself. So we had that material, but he wouldn't talk to us. So we had to get somebody to read the material. We didn't have any choice.
Got it.
And then a second case, a woman who had been a patient and was willing to talk about him was worried that her voice was so distinctive that if she allowed a taping, she would be recognized. So we had to find a way to disguise her voice, and the easiest way to do that was just to hire somebody to read her lines.
Right. So if she allowed the taping, people would recognize her even if you didn't mention her by name.
But otherwise, I know it's not that. I mean, the structure is different. But when you said, interweaving the characters and the other voices, it's not that different. That part of it, at least, from writing a book or a magazine story where you're narrating and then you're quoting somebody and then you're quoting a document and then you're back to narrating again and you're using the quotes and the documents to pull the story forward, and because it's a better way to tell the story than if you keep narrating. And so that's that part of it, I would say, is the one part that was sort of similar.
Right. I mean, that's just the craft of storytelling, right? In a different way.
Right.
So now you've formatted this what would have been a long form magazine article into the podcast, which are 6 or 8 or whatever, 20, 30 minute, 35-minute episodes. What, if anything, did you need to do differently or need to do at all on the marketing side? Because now it gets unleashed into the world. Obviously you have Wonderly, obviously you have Bloomberg, obviously it's a great story, but for every one of those there's 1,000 that sort of flop or get 12 downloads. How did it become a thing?
To be honest with you, I think, well, first of all, I think it became a thing because it was a good story, but also, I don't know how, but Wondery got great placement on the Apple iTunes website or app. So first week plus, it was the lead podcast in the new and notable section, which is the very first thing you see when you open the app. And then they time, I don't know quite how this works, but they time the first 3 episodes in a way to maximize how it will do on the Apple most listened to. So it popped to number 1 very quickly, and then it just stayed there for 3 weeks as people heard about it. And I did some interviews, but not a ton, really. And the interviews were more along the lines of writers wanting to write about the story rather than writing about the podcast. And the one place where we really got some help was the New York Times included it in its 6 great podcasts for this summer. So in terms of the marketing, I had to do less work myself, but that's because the marketers at Wondery really know how to do digital marketing.
Right.
But what I've noticed also about podcasts is that, sort of like streaming shows, word of mouth is huge. You see it on Twitter and you see it elsewhere. And I would ask people, where did you hear about The Shrink Next Door? And they'd say, well, my friend next door told me, or my friend at the office told me. And so, doing a good podcast and getting some word of mouth, that's really as important as anything.
All right, Joe, as we're wrapping up here, I want to thank you for your time today and sharing the story of a great story and how that has moved from the dusty archives to a smashing hit in the podcast world, as well as the rest of your experience. And anything else you'd like to share with other folks that are out there that are in the content and thought leadership space around playing with new modalities and staying true to your format and all that sort of fun stuff?
Well, I mean, the thing is, there's a lot of young journalists. People worry that there's no room for young journalists, and I think that really the trick now is you need to know more than one discipline. You need to know how to podcast. You need to know how to do social media. You need to know how to write. And so, my argument is there's plenty of room as long as you're willing to develop the skills.
So, and those skills haven't changed, right? I mean, you're talking about hardcore investigative journalism skills.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. The skills. That's right. It may be new formats, but the skills haven't changed. What? That's exactly right.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Joe. I look forward to your next project because they've all been so much fun as a reader and as a listener and a fan. So I appreciate your time today very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. It was a lot of fun.
Thanks.
To learn more about Thought Leadership Leverage, please visit our website at thoughtleadershipleverage.com. To reach me directly, feel free to email me at peter@thoughtleadershipleverage.com. And please subscribe to Leveraging Thought Leadership on iTunes or your favorite podcast app to get your weekly episode automatically.